begin.
Welcome everybody to Learning with Syeyutsus. My name is Ted Cadwallader. I'm co-host today with Sweetla Tantanat, Stephanie Johnson, and our friend Tom Quatten, who you can see on the screen on the right-hand side, is outside today on traditional territory. So Learning with Syeyutsus, as always, is a part of Nanaimo Ladysmith Public Schools' efforts to learn to walk in a better way on the territory of the Halkamenim-speaking peoples who they serve. Also part of Truth and Reconciliation's call to action number 57. We are pleased to raise our hand to UBC Press and the Vancouver Island Regional Libraries this year, who are helping us out and spreading the word. I would also just want to start out too to raise our hands to Lacrosse, and also joining us together today are participants for Nanaimo District Secondary School's Lacrosse Academy. Way to go, you guys. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to Tsampatan to open the house in a good way and welcome us all to this territory.
Right, en dat tiet tal steetlum tanaquail. Chachas ashmain heichka. Heichka at a hyal I squail at tanaquail. Heichka at a hyal I mit tamaf. Itu muxtem iatana. Heichka kusnitsali. Ihwam it's a watal at the matsias tiwiatama. Ihwam quam stuch to squallant. Ihwam huimatal at an aquali to muxquail. Heichka quits twa iatanatama. A tanaquail, it's a mock squail. Now a squam comes at the streets, titasi and Heichka. Whoa, 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 Stenaten tamo.
Heichka, as always, my friend. It's nice when you do that from outside, because I can envision all of those relatives around you gathering just to hear that song. So beautiful. Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. There's a chat on the bottom you can see if you want to click in and send us some questions for our author this week. We are so pleased to welcome Dr. Allan Downey to our chat today. Stephanie says we've been trying to get Allan here for a couple of years, so we're pleased that everything could work out to have him join us. He's associate professor of McMaster's University. He is Nakajli Waten and Dakar. He's a recipient of a Fulbright Fellowship to Columbia University, and probably more important, a community volunteer, probably working with kids and athletics. And we're so pleased to have him join us to talk about his book, The Creator's Game, Lacrosse Identity and Indigenous Nationhood. So welcome, Dr. Allan.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for that beautiful opening, welcoming us to the territory. I really appreciate it. Even if the territory is a virtual territory that we are on. So my name, as introduced, my name is Allan Downy. I'm the Nakajli and an associate professor in the Department of History and Indigenous Studies Department at McMaster University. And what I'm going to be doing for you today is walking you through this beautiful game that is lacrosse, the Indigenous game of lacrosse, and highlight some of the stories that I found unique or I thought that were really interesting that stood out to me throughout the course of writing this publication. So without further ado, we'll get into the presentation itself. So ultimately, what I argue in the book, The Creator's Game, is that lacrosse has historically been a critical piece of Indigenous nationhood and the articulation of self-determination. So it's been this critical and important piece of Indigenous communities for centuries. And so what I'm going to do today is weave a story for you. Weave a story between a few different kind of highlights that I came across. And this includes early lacrosse and Indigenous and Canadian history, talking about that. We'll also talk about Ganawage lacrosse and the Canadian appropriation, so just outside of Montreal. I'll talk about lacrosse in residential schools and specifically the Squamish Nation and Coast Salish nations more generally and their experience with lacrosse just a little bit. And then I'll conclude with the Iroquois Nationals, which is this really cool and amazing team that represents the Haudenosaunee as a sovereign nation in international competition. So I begin with the Creator's Game, lacrosse in Indigenous communities, because as you can see on our map, lacrosse existed at the time of the beginning of colonization or beforehand. Lacrosse existed all across North America in various Indigenous communities. So from the Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia to the Seminole Nation down to Florida, west to the Pomo Nation in California, north into Coast Salish and Interior Salish territories, and all in between, we know that Indigenous nations had the game of lacrosse. Now, the specific stick types, the rules, the standards of physicality, what was accepted and not accepted in the standards of physicality, all were determined by the nations themselves. So, for instance, the Haudenosaunee, specifically the Cayuga, for instance, nation, because the Haudenosaunee are made up of 6 nations in Ontario, Southern Ontario, Northern New York State, and Southern Quebec. They played with 1 large stick, but other nations like Choctaw and Anishinaabe could have 1 smaller stick or even 2 sticks. And it really depended on the Indigenous nation that you went to that had this game and had this sport. And we know that it existed in various places, but specifically, I can trace it and I've seen it in Coast Salish territories. There's a very rich history of lacrosse in Coast Salish territory. And I've seen it on Vancouver Island. I've seen it in Squamish territory and Musqueam territory. There are many, many, many mentions by anthropologists and oral histories about the game of lacrosse in Coast Salish territory. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of oral histories that discuss the brilliance of this Indigenous game and where it came from. And so I actually want to share one of those with you today. The following story was told to me by my good friend Delmore Jacobs, who's a Cayuga or was a Cayuga faith keeper from Six Nations of the Grand River. So just about 45 minutes outside of Toronto, Ontario. Now, Delmore recently passed away. And one of the conversations that I had with Delmore, I asked him, Delmore, what do I do with this story? It's not my story to tell. I'm non-Haudenosaunee. It's a Haudenosaunee story. And he expressed to me that he wants this out in the world. He wants people to hear it and share this story. So I'll be reading from my book, but these are Delmore Jacobs' words from Six Nations of the Grand River. It began in a world up above the clouds, we're told. Above the clouds, there was a community, a land, I guess, a reality that looked very much like the reality we had with longhouses and those types of buildings and that sort of thing. Well, in this land, there were a people, and the head of these people was one person, a man, who was designated to look after this particular tree, we're told, that grew in the middle of this land. Now, this tree was called the Tree of Light, and this male, he was married, and as some couples do, they were expecting a child. And with this, when she became pregnant, she had these horrible cravings, and she was told through a dream that if she made tea from the bark of this Tree of Light that grew in the middle of this land up above the clouds, it would alleviate the cravings. And it was like, oh, okay. So going to her husband, she said she wanted to do this. Spurred through a dream, she was told that she could alleviate these cravings. But her husband's, his job was to let no one bring harm to this tree. So he looked after it so that no one would bring harm to this tree. But she was persistent, and she kept saying, no, I need to make tea out of this Tree of Light. But he says, no, I can't do that. I can't do that. But the wife is persistent and says, yes, you can, and on and on. And so they get to the tree growing in the middle of this land, and he gives in. They get to the tree. And when she gets to the tree, she starts to notice something by the roots of that tree. They go into the ground. There was a space that she could see something under the tree. And when she looked and asked her husband, what is that? What's under that tree? And he didn't say anything about it. She kept being really curious, and her curiosity was growing more and more. She actually wanted him to lift up that tree so she could see what was underneath it. Again, she's being really curious. And the argument goes, well, he couldn't bring harm to this tree or let anyone else bring harm to this tree. So he says, I can't do that. I can't lift up this tree. And eventually, after much time, he gives in because he loves her. Even though he broke the rules to do this, he lifted up the tree and there was a hole there. And she looked, and we're told that it was all dark with the exception of a little blue ball. And she was so curious. She looked and looked and looked, and she got right down on her hands and knees and peered down into that hole, looking right into that hole. And she fell into that hole. Well, she's falling now. And we're told that as she was falling for a while. And we don't know if it was days, weeks, or months, but all she could hear was the wind blowing past her ears and through her hair going, and this was the sound that she heard. And eventually this little blue ball, it was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And what she noticed was that it was all liquid. It was all water. And it was the birds, were told. It was the geese that saw this woman falling from the sky. And they knew that if she hit the water, she would perish. So they flew under her and they carried her for a while. Well, during that time, they knew they could only carry her for a little while and not too long. And it was the great sea turtle that rose up and said, put her on my back. So they landed her safely on the back of the turtle. And over time, she started to ask about everything around this world, this water world that she now existed in. She asked all the creatures if there was any dirt, was there any earth that she could help create a world like she once had up above the clouds, up above the sky. And so they said, yes, there is, but it's way under the water. And so there were 3 different aquatic animals that agreed that they would go after it, after this dirt or earth underneath this water. And it was the beaver, the otter, and the muskrat. The beaver tried first, flapping his tail as hard as possible, but he didn't make it. He didn't survive. Next, the otter tried. The otter kicked his little feet as hard as he could, dove down into the water, and went even further. But he too didn't make it and died. Finally, the muskrat comes next. The muskrat takes a deep breath, dives down and kicks his little feet as hard as he could. And the water was calm as they waited. Nothing. Nothing. And they feared the worst. And then whoosh, out of the water, muskrat came up, and in his little paw, he had a bit of dirt or earth, but he also died for this. And so when she got it, she put it on the turtle's back and spread it around a little bit, spreading it around like this. And Delmore shows with her feet. And it is still a Haudenosaunee women's dance to this day, the shuffle dance, longhouse dance. So she kept going around and around and around. And in the end, what she ended up doing was creating Turtle Island. That's why Indigenous peoples, or the Haudenosaunee specifically, call it Turtle Island. Okay, I promise I'm getting to Lacrosse, but it does take a long time to create the world. So we're getting there. And so if you remember, she was pregnant when she fell out of the sky into this world and created Turtle Island. And so she had her child, and it was a female child. And when it came time for her female child of childbearing age, she actually became pregnant. So it's like, how does that happen when there are no males around or nothing like that? And when she was asked by her grandmother, she said that the spirit of the west wind came to her and placed 2 crossed arrows on her belly. So they had 2 arrows and they were crossed like this. And Delmore demonstrates it like this. One was blunt and one was sharp. And what it represented was that she was pregnant with twins. So this is the beginning of kind of good and evil, or the good mind and the bad mind. We're even told that in the womb, these 2 twins fought. The brothers fought because they're 2 male twins. And when it came time for them to be born, our creator, the good twin, was born in the normal way that a baby is born into this world. And then our uncle, the Haudenosaunee's uncle, came second. He came out of his mother's side, out of her armpit, and killed his mother. And so he is seen as evil. He's totally evil. He's born that way. And that is all that he knows, just that. And when they were growing up, we're told our creator created all of the good things in the world. And our uncle came after it and created the opposite of things. So they are opposites. That's a very key thing Delmore emphasizes. Even with it, you have the good and the bad mind. So as we progress, they both created things in the world. And when it came down to a dispute, our creator was going to create people here, and our younger brother apparently never had that kind of power, but he knew he wanted that kind of power. He wanted this world to kind of follow his way, to be all bad-minded. And our creator was going to create people here to be good, and that was the dispute. So our uncle, just being a bad guy, all he wanted to do was kill. But it was our creator that pointed out, instead of doing that, how about we do it through games? See, one of the interesting things that Delmore points out to me in this story is that the twins were raised by their grandmother, because the bad-minded twin had killed his mother, who actually becomes Mother Earth. What ends up happening is they're taught by their grandmother, who came from the sky world, that Lacrosse is a way to settle disputes. That's what existed in the sky world, to be able to settle these disputes. So getting back to the twins, whoever won the game will win the dispute and will win the world. So they both agreed. They decided, actually, the first game was going to be not Lacrosse, the Great Peach Bowl game. And so they played this, and they were playing for the world. And just for people that don't know, the Peach Bowl game, which is played in the Haudenosaunee Longhouse to this day, it's a bowl, and you have peach pits basically, and they're dark on one side and light on the other side. And what you try to do is you try to flip them and get them all one color. And it's a betting game, and it goes back and forth between two sides. So they played this for 6 days, but nobody won because they're equally powerful. So they put it to the side, and the next game that they played was the stick and ball game of lacrosse. So you can't touch the ball with your hand. That is where everything came from. That was a rule they agreed upon. And so that is where the stick was involved. So they had to have something like a stick. And the stick even was designated how long, and it was agreed between the two parties. So the ball, the stick, everything else was agreed upon between the two parties. And then they started the game, the stick and ball game. So with lacrosse, after the creator had created it, they played that again for 6 days, going back and forth, playing for the world, but they couldn't beat each other because they were equally powerful, and nobody won. And our uncle, just being our uncle, or the Haudenosaunee's uncle, okay, just bad-minded, his bad mind kept building up and building up in these games. And he just wanted to win and get it over with. So he said, we aren't getting anywhere. And he just flew off the handle and he threw his stick to the side. And then all of a sudden, he grabbed the nearest thing, another stick shaped like a spear, and he lunged at our creator, trying to kill him. A creator eluded him and grabbed a deer's antler, picked up our uncle, and drove him into the ground, locking him into the underworld. And that is how the underworld became our uncle's domain. And so that's where it all began. This is where the creator's game, from a Haudenosaunee perspective, comes from. So how is it that the game of lacrosse, this critical piece of Indigenous communities and Indigenous identities for centuries, becomes a key component of Canada? See, what ends up happening is non-Indigenous peoples are introduced to the game in 1844, or actually they play lacrosse against a non-Indigenous team for the very first time in 1884. These young, kind of influential, non-Indigenous white Montrealers, generally Anglophone Montrealers, so those that only speak English, in the Montreal area, were introduced to the game of lacrosse by Indigenous community members from Ganawage and Akwesasne and Gunnesatake, 3 communities within about an hour and a half of Montreal. And these Indigenous communities would come and demonstrate this game in front of non-Indigenous audiences in the 1840s. Well, in 1844, we get the first game of lacrosse between Indigenous and non-Indigenous players. This would be a kind of a key date, a key year in the appropriation of the game of lacrosse. Because of the introduction of the game of lacrosse by Indigenous athletes, non-Indigenous players begin picking up this game. And it becomes kind of so popular that they formulate a lacrosse organization known as the Montreal Lacrosse Club in 1856. Now, at the center of this organization very early on is a person that I like to call the architect of the colonialism of, or the architect of the colonialism of lacrosse, or the colonization of lacrosse. And that's a person by the name of W.G. Beers, who's here on the left. Now, W.B.G. Beers is a really interesting kind of character in this whole kind of history of lacrosse, in that he was a lacrosse enthusiast. He's a middle-class British Anglophone, kind of stark Canadian nationalist at this time, or develops into that in between the 1850s and 1860s. And he really falls in love with this game of lacrosse. One of the ideas that he has is that See, Canada at this time, in the 1850s and 1860s, Canadians don't really know what it means to be Canadian. They are trying to figure out and identify what differentiates them from being American or British or Irish or Scottish, whatever it might be, or French. And one of the ways that they attempt to do this, or one of the ways that Beers attempts to do this, is he says we should start appropriating Indigenous activities. And there's a great book on this by Gillian Poulter, who talks about this. It's called Becoming Native in a Foreign Land. And what he ends up doing is saying that, one of the ways in which we can unite Canadians and situate a Canadian identity is to actually appropriate Indigenous activities, and including the game of lacrosse that he's such an adamant fan of. And so what he starts to do is, through his organization, the Montreal Lacrosse Club, they start forming visual images in newspapers and written histories. And he is one of the first, if not the first, kind of sports reporters in the 1850s. He starts reporting in newspapers in Montreal about lacrosse games between Indigenous and non-Indigenous athletes and Indigenous and Indigenous athletes. And what he starts to do is he starts to appropriate this activity and starts to say, oh, this is a Canadian game because it's from this place. It is of this territory. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. What he also attempts to do is he's attempting to instill this sense of idea of values. What do British Anglophone Canadians hold near and dear to themselves as what do they want to recreate in the world? And one of the things that he kind of situates or explains is that they want to recreate this idea of manly accord, what it means to be a man in Canada at this time. And so he uses lacrosse and says, we can appropriate this activity from Indigenous peoples and use it as a way to instill values into Canadians, the values that we want them to emulate, to be industrious and to be manly and to be specifically through sport, looking at like the masculinization of non-Indigenous men. Well, one of the things that he does during this time is he recognizes that Indigenous performers, Indigenous athletes are key to this endeavor, because in order to get the message out, he needs an audience. He needs an audience in the newspaper. He needs an audience in live performances or live lacrosse games. And so one of the things that he starts doing is encouraging Indigenous lacrosse teams from Ganawage to come and play exhibition matches or competitive matches against non-Indigenous teams in Montreal. And these draw thousands and thousands of people. And you have to think about it. In Montreal, in the 1860s, they don't have stadiums, they don't have public transportation. So to have thousands of people show up to a field is really significant. And we might be talking about 1,500, 2,000, maybe 3,000 people, but it's really, really significant. And the reason why all these non-Indigenous spectators are showing up is because they have this very pervasive belief in the vanishing Indian myth. The vanishing Indian myth perceived, this was a kind of a myth, a very, very prominent myth within non-Indigenous Canadian society, that understood or believed that Indigenous peoples were inferior racially, socially, economically, and that because of their inferiority, they were going to literally disappear. They were going to be wiped off the earth. And so thousands of people would come out to these lacrosse games, hoping to catch a glimpse at these so-called quote unquote Indians that were going to disappear. And so it really pushed the number of people that would show up to these lacrosse contests. Well, one of the things that occurs throughout this lacrosse history is that Beers and his Montreal Lacrosse Club hope to start to increase their control over this Indigenous game and actually appropriate it into a non-Indigenous Canadian element. And one of the ways that they do this, Beers does this specifically, is he writes a uniform code of rules in 1860, and he builds upon that in 1867. Now, Indigenous peoples and Indigenous nations always had rules. It's very important to recognize this. But Beers would kind of promote this idea that they were lawless, that Indigenous peoples, of course, didn't have governance, laws, or rules when it came to their sports, which is completely and utterly false. We know from the very beginning, as Delmore Jacobs has demonstrated, that the game of lacrosse had rules. You couldn't touch the ball with your hands. That was one of the rules. But Beers perpetuates this idea that lacrosse needs to be, quote unquote, tamed from the savagery of Indigenous peoples. And so what he ends up doing to help control the development of the game and the colonization of it is he begins to introduce a uniform code of rules. And in 1867, there's something really interesting happens, because when he writes his uniform code of rules for Canadian lacrosse organizations to follow, which is generally located in major cities, lacrosse organizations were located in major cities like Montreal and Toronto in 1867. One of the rules he introduces says that no Indian can play in a game unless previously agreed upon. Well, this is segregation. This is segregation 101. Canadians like to pretend that they don't have a long history of segregation, which is again false. He introduces this idea of segregation. Indigenous players could play against non-Indigenous teams as long as they were all on an all-Indigenous team, but no Indigenous individual could play for a non-Indigenous team. Now, this stemmed from a lot of ideas about the racial superiority, physical superiority of Indigenous players, and all this kind of racist rhetoric that existed at the time. But he introduces in his first uniform code of rules in 1867 a partial ban. Now, as the colonization of lacrosse is taking place with non-Indigenous communities, organizations start to grow in the Montreal area and in Toronto and in Winnipeg and in Halifax, eventually in the late 1880s, excuse me, in the Vancouver area. What ends up happening is Beers knows that he really has to kind of demonstrate this Canadian nationalism. And one of the best ways for him to sell this image, these ideas, to people is to actually host international lacrosse exhibitions. And so one of the biggest ones that occurs, there's several that occur during this time period in 1867 and 1876, and again in 1880. There are a few lacrosse exhibitions with non-Indigenous teams playing Indigenous teams. He actually promotes this idea of taking a team from Montreal and a team from Ganawage, just outside of Montreal, the Indigenous team, to go play in front of Queen Victoria in 1876. And they actually go on a British lacrosse tour. Now, what he's attempting to do, and what the Montreal Lacrosse Club is attempting to do, is they're actually trying to signify, they're trying to sell this idea of a national identity through the game of lacrosse, the appropriated game of lacrosse, at home, so through media like the Montreal Press, and abroad by selling it to the kind of British Empire, to state this is our game as Canadians, this is how we articulate who we are as Canadians. And so the interesting thing that's occurring here is that if you look at my little diagram here, we have quote unquote Indians, right? And lacrosse is native to the Indians. And Indians and lacrosse are being claimed as native to Canada. Therefore, that is helping Canadians establish a unique identity. So what I'm stating here, if that's not clear, is that Canada in order to articulate, particularly beers, in order to articulate that they have a unique identity, they start claiming the game of lacrosse because it's native to the land that they are foreign to, that Canadians are foreign to, right? So what they're trying to do is give a source of legitimacy for their identity, and they're grounding it in the very place, Canada, that they are now claiming as their own. So they're claiming lacrosse because it's an Indigenous activity, and they're even claiming Indigenous peoples as Canada's Indians, right? And the reason why they're doing this is because Indigenous peoples and lacrosse are of this place. They are of this territory. They are from the very land which Canadians are now claiming as their own and expropriating and taking. So some interesting things happen very quickly. And what ends up happening is after 1867, Beers helps formulate and form a new national lacrosse organization known as the National Lacrosse Association of Canada. It introduces segregation of Indigenous athletes. Well, that organization grows immensely to become kind of a national organization, which wasn't all that national. It was actually kind of mostly around central Canada, so Montreal and Toronto and Woodstock, Ontario, and smaller towns in and around that area. But the National Lacrosse Association actually transforms into the National Amateur Lacrosse Association in 1880. And what they end up doing is banning Indigenous players outright. So within about 30 years, 25 to 30 years, Indigenous athletes go from introducing non-Indigenous players to the game of lacrosse. These non-Indigenous athletes, like Beers and others, end up forming a lacrosse organization known as the Montreal Lacrosse Organization. They formulate in 1867 a national organization, segregate Indigenous athletes, and by 1880, they outright ban them from their own game. Now, the interesting thing is that Indigenous athletes are never defined by their ability to play in, with, or amongst non-Indigenous organizations. So they're playing games between Indigenous communities and Indigenous communities, Indigenous nations versus Indigenous nations, inter-community games. So there's a lot going on within Indigenous communities, all kind of detailed in the book. Well, so why is this important, and why should we really care about this lacrosse history? Well, the interesting thing is that this notion that lacrosse is a Canadian sport, that it's a Canadian game sold by Beers, it becomes so powerful, it becomes so pervasive within the minds of Canadians. By 1889, they start introducing it into residential schools to actually assimilate Indigenous youth. And so we see that sport and recreational activities are actually thrust into residential schools, into residential schools as a way to help assimilate Indigenous youth into Canadian society as part of that cultural genocide, or we can just call it genocide, that was perpetrated on Indigenous communities and targeted towards Indigenous communities. Well, what we see is sport has a haphazard start in residential schools. What I mean by that is there was really no kind of universal national residential school sport policy. Rather, what sports were offered in residential schools were actually dictated by those running the schools locally. So it depended on what school you were at. But we see lacrosse after 1889 in Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia become really prominent in residential schools. And the idea behind introducing sport, and specifically lacrosse, was that it was to be used and introduced as a vehicle for moral training. This was a way, Canadians believe and understand that sport introduces moral character, excuse me, and these notions of what they wanted Canadian masculinity to look like. What did they want Canadian boys and Canadian men to emulate and recreate? It's called a gendered performance. Well, they knew sport could do this. They could introduce the idea of what was sportsmanship and what was physical activity and what was physically acceptable and not acceptable, and what represented industriousness. All of these things was inculcated by lacrosse and by sport. Well, the really interesting thing that I came across was the story of the Squamish Nation and Andy Paul. So there's a really interesting story here, because in 1899, there's an individual who's approximately 7 years old. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I believe he's 7 years old, named Andy Paul. And he is chosen to attend the local residential school in North Vancouver, known as the Squamish Indian boarding school or residential school. It has various names at various times. And while he is there, in 1905, the local administrators of that residential school, the Squamish Indian Residential School, or St. Paul's, actually introduced the game of lacrosse. Now, the really interesting thing that happens here is, in order for Canadians to, again, have a legitimate source of identity stating that they were Canadian, they had to ground it in something local, right? So they do it through lacrosse, being of the territory from this place, and the quote unquote Indians. They claim them. So when they introduce the game of lacrosse at residential schools, they actually promote this idea. Oh, this is a great Canadian game. This will teach you how to speak English. This will teach you sportsmanship and our definitions of physicality, all of these things that we want you to be assimilated into, to forget your identities, to forget your languages. But don't forget, this game of lacrosse is an Indian game. And they have to do this because they're trying to claim this unique sense of identity, but they need to ground it in something that is of this place. Of course, the game of lacrosse being from this place, they are doing that. Well, for Andy Paul and other local Squamish residential school survivors, they don't gravitate when they're introduced to this game of it being a Canadian national pastime or pursuit. They actually gravitate towards the idea that it's an Indigenous game, which becomes really cool. So I don't have a lot of time to talk about this, but the book covers it. Andy Paul becomes a really prominent Indigenous rights activist and a union leader throughout the 19-teens and the 1920s. One of the things that he does is he starts up, in addition to his Indigenous rights activist movements and into his union organizing, he starts up lacrosse teams. He saw lacrosse as a way to articulate a kind of national identity as Squamish. So he's like, as Indigenous peoples, we should be playing an Indigenous game. What better way to articulate what it means to be Squamish than through an Indigenous game? And so in the 19-teens and the 1920s, he starts forming Indigenous Squamish lacrosse teams. By the early 1930s, they become huge. These lacrosse games and these lacrosse competitions are taking on this kind of life of their own in the Vancouver area. And at the center of all of this is Andy Paul, the coach and organizer who starts putting together these lacrosse teams in the early 1930s. And in particular, in 1935, he starts recruiting Haudenosaunee athletes from Six Nations of the Grand River and eventually from Akwesasne and other Haudenosaunee communities to actually come and play for his team and to compete at the highest level in lacrosse in 1935 and 1936. So for those that are familiar with lacrosse in Vancouver area, you might know of a team named the North Shore Indians. Before 1934, 1935, they're actually known as the Squamish Indians. But when Andy Paul starts recruiting Haudenosaunee athletes in 1935, he renames the team the North Shore Indians, which still exists to this very day. And he creates this team to compete on a national level against non-Indigenous teams. So Andy Paul, thanks to Andy Paul, he actually reintroduces Indigenous athletes to the highest level of Canadian national competition through the creation of his teams. And there's a lot more covered in the book on that. But it's a really interesting story in a transnational relationship between the Haudenosaunee and between the Squamish Nation. And Andy Paul is a really interesting person to study. The last story I want to shift to is the creation and the formation of a really cool team known as the Iroquois Nationals. Now they've changed their name. They still exist to this day. They're known as the Haudenosaunee Nationals. And I want to talk a little bit about their early history. So the Iroquois Nationals are an international lacrosse team that represent the Haudenosaunee in international competition as a sovereign nation. This is really significant. The reason why this is really significant is because they're the only team in the world that represents an Indigenous nation as a sovereign nation in international competition. Now, there is one exception to this. There's the Maori All Black rugby team from New Zealand, but they actually cannot, the Maori All Black team doesn't compete in the World Cup of Rugby as a sovereign nation. You actually have to play for New Zealand if you want to represent the nation or the nation state. And so the Iroquois Nationals actually represent the Haudenosaunee as a sovereign nation. So what ends up happening is I'm taking you up to the 1970s, because in the 1970s, we get this incredible Indigenous political mobilization by various Indigenous communities and individuals. And what they're attempting to do as a group is in the 1970s, particularly the Haudenosaunee, they're attempting to figure out a way to assert their sovereignty in new ways. How do they represent themselves as independent from Canada and the United States? Because they've never, as Indigenous peoples, they have never given up their sovereignty. They have never released their sovereignty. In fact, Audra Simpson calls it a nested sovereignty. That is, it's a sovereignty within the sovereignty of Canada and of the United States. There's a localized sovereignty of Indigenous sovereignty. And so the people, the Haudenosaunee, are attempting to kind of find new ways to articulate this very, very old idea that they are a sovereign nation, that they are independent from Canada and the United States. And one of the ways that a few individuals thought about doing this was through the game of lacrosse. What better way to represent Haudenosaunee sovereignty than to reappropriate the game and articulate their sovereignty through creating an independent national organization, the Iroquois Nationals. And so it was three individuals, including Wes Patterson, Rick Hill, and Orrin Lyons, as well as Carol Patterson, Wes Patterson's wife, who decided in 1980 that they were going to form an international lacrosse team as a one-time adventure. Well, after they do that and they compete in an international competition, the idea was brought forward to them, hey, why don't you do this and try to get into the World Cup of Lacrosse, represent the Haudenosaunee in the International Lacrosse Federation's quadrennial, or every 4 years, World Cup of Lacrosse, so the World Lacrosse Championships. So they actually start promoting us the idea. And very early on, there's early skepticism, particularly from the nations that play in this World Lacrosse Championships. Now, the two nations that were most skeptical or resistant, let's say, was Canada and Australia. Canada said, well, why should we allow the Haudenosaunee Nationals, who exist on Canada's territories and the United States territories. Why should we allow them to come into international lacrosse competition? They're not a sovereign nation, was what they said, basically. And they were worried that the Haudenosaunee the Iroquois Nationals were going to start taking from their talent pool, right? Because some of the Haudenosaunee in southern Ontario and southern Quebec are within Canada's colonial borders, and some are within the US borders, such as in and around upstate New York. And so Canada's worried that the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Nationals, are going to take out of their talent pool. Well, Australia is also resistant to this idea of an Iroquois Nationals lacrosse team in the early 1980s. Their reasoning for it was they had said, well, if we have to recognize the history of colonialism and the horrific relationship that Canada and the United States has had with its Indigenous peoples, does that mean that we as Australians have to then identify and discuss our horrific relationship with Indigenous peoples within our territories and within our boundaries? And so they become really resistant to the idea of a Iroquois Nationals team. But one of the things that occurs is these leaders of the Iroquois Nationals are highly respected within the lacrosse community. And so the ILF challenged the Iroquois Nationals. They say, okay, if you want to form a team, you have to prove financially, competitively, and politically that you can actually see this through. Well, financially is kind of self-explanatory. Can you financially field a team? It costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to go to these competitions. Can you financially do it? Competitively, are you going to get embarrassed in front of the world in these lacrosse competitions? And some of the Haudenosaunee athletes are the best athletes in the world, so that wasn't really a concern, but they had to prove that they could competitively field a team. The most interesting part is they had to politically prove that they could travel to these various competitions internationally. And the reason I say that is because the Iroquois Nationals travel on the Haudenosaunee passport. So they had to prove to the International Lacrosse Organization, the ILF at the time, that they could actually successfully travel on the Haudenosaunee passport and get it recognized internationally. So they actually do this. They prove financially, competitively, and politically throughout the early mid-1980s that they're able to do this. And they win in a competition against England. They traveled to England on the Haudenosaunee passport, and they successfully do all three things. Well, despite this, in 1987, despite proving all the naysayers wrong and facing resistance from places like Canada and Australia, they attempt to get into the ILF World Games in 1986, and they're actually turned down. And the reasoning behind it was Canada said that they would have to reprint the programs and tickets in order to allow the Iroquois Nationals to participate. So they just gave them a really ridiculous excuse for not allowing them. But ultimately, behind closed doors, from what I heard, it was, again, going to this notion that the Iroquois Nationals didn't represent a sovereign nation. So how dare they try to come and participate in our lacrosse governing body and championship? Well, in 1987, the Iroquois Nationals are persistent and their organization is persistent, and they're actually accepted into the ILF. And they first compete in international competition, at least officially, in 1990 in Perth, Australia. They travel on the Haudenosaunee passport. And one of the really interesting stories that comes out of this was as they were preparing for this World Lacrosse Championships, they were asked to bring their flag. Well, the Iroquois Nationals and the Haudenosaunee didn't have a flag. So it was actually the lacrosse team that created the Haudenosaunee Nation's flag, or the Haudenosaunee Nation Confederacy's flag. What they did was they took a wampum belt that, I don't have time to describe this story or to articulate this story, the set of laws, but it's the formation of the original 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. It's a story and a set of laws relating back to how they came together. Eventually, a 6th nation would join that confederacy. So they use a wampum belt, which is, it's a belt beaded with these symbols on it. And you might recognize it as basically 4 squares with a pine tree in the middle. And they turn that into the flag for the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is a really neat story. It's the lacrosse team that creates that flag. So I've covered a lot of territory, a lot of time, a lot of topics. I really hope that you enjoyed this presentation. I really appreciate everybody tuning in for it. It's been a lot of fun. If you want more detail, it's all kind of covered in the Creators Game by UBC Press.
Great. Alan, if you could unshare your screen, we'll come back together and we'll close our house. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that was it's an amazing book. You did a hero's effort of trying to put all of the things in this book within the last hour. I loved in the book how you honored those families and those people who held up that game, who took it to where you ended with the Iroquois Nationals. An amazing story for those who want to come back and read the whole thing. The themes of appropriation and reclamation and nationalism and medicine as a tool for medicine and honor of the Creators Game. I hope all of those people who are out there playing that game recognize that its core start and its tool as a way to bring people together and a way to heal. I'm going to turn it over to our brother Tzomquatan to close our house, but I just wanted to raise my hands and thanks for you sharing all of that today.
CM Schwakwa, Kach Dunsias Titel Namet Etanaquel, E Nesliquinus Siatama, Flathaket Hayal CM Schqualwin, at Quamquam Stuch to Schqualwin Etanaquel, Tatel at Siat at Lacrosse. Limu Hiluk Tanashqualwin Sathamatama. I'm really happy to hear everything that you've shared. And I really thank you for all the hard work that you've done to get to where we're at today and laying down your most beautiful and respected feelings in the truth of the It really brought great strength to all of us to learn more and more about our history as a people and our history all over. I'm just really grateful. I felt like a little kid sitting in front of a teacher. So I thank you for bringing that little boy out inside me. And now I want to learn more. So you've done a great service to myself personally, but I'm sure to the whole crowd that has been listening. So really quit stuch tana tzelish at nawa atanaquail. I am really raising my hands to you and thanking you today. Let's go.